We'll see. I think I've left plenty of time for some discussion at the end too. So I'm going to talk about queer quantitative methodologies in the context of critical quantitative methodologies broadly, with some specific thinking about how queer theory might show up in those spaces as well. So my kind of outline is I'll introduce myself quickly, and then just share a little bit about questions that usually seem to come up in these contexts about like what about demographic questions on surveys and things like that. So I'll try to offer a few thoughts there and then spend most of the time in this queer quant methodological framework piece, and then planning to have plenty of time for us to talk as well. So about me, I'm an associate professor of research methodology at Virginia Commonwealth University here in Richmond, Virginia. Also editor of the Journal of Queer and Trans Studies in Education, and of the Queer Studies in Education book series with Brill, and also author of a series of statistical analysis textbooks where we try to incorporate criticality in ways that still make the books usable for general stats classes or traditional stats classes. And just putting a plug in here as I was thinking about it, that we do have the recent special issue of Educational Studies on Queer Quantitative Methodologies, where there's a few other perspectives on this topic as well. So about my work, I am a quantitative methodologist, and I work in areas including intersectional queer studies in education, including critical race studies as well as the psychology of education and research methodologies, especially critical quantitative methodologies. So like I said, I thought I would just start with just a quick couple minutes about how we might see queer and trans identities come up in survey research. And again, I'm including this because it seems like anytime I talk about queer quant, people ask questions about this. So I'll just like put it up front about how we might collect identity information. And to do that, we might start with quick and imperfect definitions, because obviously terminology is fluid and has different meanings in different contexts at different times. But broadly speaking, when we think about sex assigned at birth, this is based on external genital presentation at birth. It's assigned on the birth certificate, is related to, but not necessarily the same as chromosomal differences, which might correlate to various hormones, physiology, and other differences. And we know that about 1.7% of all people are born intersex, though most are still assigned male or female at birth. Some states and nations include an X option in addition to those options as well. And then separate from that construct is the construct of gender, which is a social construct that may or may not have a correlation with sex assigned at birth. It often gets associated with notions of masculinity, femininity, androgyny, and to the socialization and social processes. But I should say sex assigned at birth is not a purely biological phenomenon. It's also a social category. The actual underlying biology is quite a lot more complicated than we pretend in assigning sex categories to people, which we then sort of turn into a binary, even though it's not a binary construct. So then we build a social system sort of on top of that of gender, which gets infinitely more complex and nuanced. And then thirdly, sexuality. Of course, they're related to the affectional, sexual, and romantic orientation. Often we're thinking about which, if any, genders one is attracted to in terms of romantic or affectional relationships or sexual relationships. Sexuality can also take on a political and social identity component. I think this is especially true sometimes for like folks who identify as queer, that might have a political dimension to that choice of sort of personal label. Two other words that come up in survey research: transgender and cisgender. So cisgender people are either people who were assigned female at birth and are a woman or girl, or they were assigned male at birth and they are a man or a boy. Cisgender is just a word that describes that situation. And Christina mentioned at the top, like X going downhill. So like X considers the word cisgender a slur. It isn't, it's just a word that describes the situation where gender identity aligns with the general social expectation of particular sex assigned at birth. And transgender people are those whose gender identity doesn't align with that general social expectation based on sex assigned at birth. So a person assigned female at birth and is a man or a non-binary person might also consider themselves trans or transgender. And some people don't really identify with either term. So these terms are also complex and don't really exist quite in this binary. But I pointed out because what we often see in survey research is a conflation of sex assigned at birth, gender, and transgender as like all sort of interchangeable things. And so we see like recently saw a survey that went out through a professional association where the options for gender were male, female, transgender, other, which, right, these are bad items because transgender people could be a man or a woman or a non-binary person or any number of genders, and male and female aren't genders, they're sex assigned at birth. So anyway, we see really bad survey stuff happen where people are conflating these concepts quite a bit. And so that would be my number one tip if you're thinking about just like, how do I get identity information, is to avoid that conflation of sex assigned at birth and gender. They're not the same thing. We should be careful about that language. We should be offering operational definitions in our work to explain how we're thinking about them. And again, trans people can have any gender or sexual identity as well, right? In addition to identifying as trans or transgender. In thinking about how you might construct identity questions for surveys, the first question would be why? What is the reason that you're collecting those data? What do you plan to do with them? What's the utility of those data? Are they necessary to the question? Are they helpful information to have? Second, who is going to be in the survey population or sample, right? Like, what are the relevant terms, ideas, concepts for that context? I always actually encourage people to think about, if it's feasible, open-ended questions. Just asking people, what is your gender identity? What is your sexual identity? We can do this for other categories too, like what racial identity? And then going back and coding those later. And I think people often really worry about the coding part, like, oh, it's going to be so much work. We're going to spend weeks coding the responses. And the reality is, like, I've done this quite a bit, and it's really actually not that hard to code the responses because the vast majority of people are choosing one of a few options. And so it's just, sort the responses alphabetically, and you can code all the people who said the exact same thing as being in the same group together. And typically I find we're left with 5 to 10% of the sample that's not in a category that's listed something that isn't really common for other people to list. And so then it's maybe 5% of the responses that really need deeper thought. But sometimes it's not feasible, either because of the way the survey is designed or for other reasons. To use open-ended, you might have to use closed-ended, in which case I would say think about what options are going to be relevant for this group. I would also say to avoid an other category and think about other ways of saying that if you do need to have some category to capture things that you didn't envision. For example, I prefer to write in my own. I'd also think, especially around gender, you can think about, or actually any closed-ended questions. Another thing you can do is like a two-step process where you have the open-ended, what is your gender? And then a closed-ended, if you had to choose from the following list, which one most closely matches, which can be helpful, particularly like I think sometimes funders or working with a government agency, they might want us to use a particular set of categories to look at representativeness, for example. And so then it can be helpful to acknowledge, like, I know that people identify in lots of ways. What is your identity? And then here's a list that we're going to have to work with. If you had to choose one of these, which one is closest for you? Even that bit of acknowledgement can be humanizing. Would also suggest thinking about select all that apply for closed-ended questions when those are needed. Some categories to think about along gender. We might have categories, and these would be more for adult because of man and woman as options, non-binary, genderqueer, agender, two-spirit. And you can think about different ways to order these and whether all of these are relevant. And if there might be other options that are relevant, but so for example, you can order them alphabetically, you can order them sort of the way they are here in terms of like frequency of occurrence in the population, but okay, we randomize the order. Sexuality, we might think about things like heterosexual, gay, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, asexual, queer. We'll note that there's a certain proportion of heterosexual participants who will object to the lack of straight as an option. And the reason that I would not tend to use that option is that straight implies as its counterpart like crooked. And so I would prefer heterosexual for that group, but you will get some write-ins with that sometimes. Sex assigned at birth, we might ask people male, female, intersex. And if it's important to know about transgender folks in the sample, we might need to ask that separately. For example, it cannot feel great if we go back to the list of gender to have like man as an option and then transgender man as an option. It's sort of, there's an othering that's happening there. You could have options that were like cisgender man, cisgender woman, transgender woman as examples, or you can do it in 2 items where the second item asks about transgender identity. Just as ways to potentially think about those survey items. So those are my thoughts about survey items, which again, just tend to get that question. So, oh, sorry. Maybe trying to ask. Okay. I think it might have just been an accidental unmute. So just thought I would touch on that up front before getting to what I actually want to talk about, which is the queer quant methodological framework that I've been writing about a little bit lately. And so I'm going to assume, given the topic of this group, that some of this is familiar, so I'll move quickly through some of the background context, but it's been pretty rapid shifts in the landscape for critical quantitative methods. And I think, probably the earliest developments were like quantitative criticalism, folks like Stage and Wells as examples. More recently, like the past, I guess it's now about 7, 8 years, we've seen the growth of QuantQueer, which is, I'll talk a little bit more about, but quantitative critical race theory. Folks like Garcia, Gilborn, Castillo are very central in that area. We've also seen the growth of queer quantitative approaches, folks like Suarez, Kilgo, and Garvey being some key names there. And the reason why this has happened is that quant methods are a mess, right? In terms of equity work, the history of quant methods is really closely tied to and inseparable from the history of the eugenics movement. A lot of the founders of quant methods were avid eugenicists, sometimes Nazi sympathizers, sometimes really open and avowed anti-Semites. Most of them were really open and avowed white supremacists. And so I can offer a couple of examples. For example, Edward Thorndike, one of the people thought of as the father of statistics in social sciences, wrote that racial differences that were in intelligence tests were original differences of, quote, character and skill related to families and races from which individuals spring. Robert Yerkes, another founder or father of modern statistics in social sciences, wrote that statistics should be used to help society avoid the, quote, menace of race deterioration, which he saw as being the result of intermarriage between people of different racial groups. More applied terms, like we probably all know Fisher from Fisher's exact test, or the F test, otherwise known as the ANOVA, and of course regression and other methods that he developed. And Fisher is a literal card-carrying eugenicist. He actively campaigned for the forced sterilization of people he deemed inferior. He is an example of somebody who was sympathetic to the Nazi eugenics and genocide campaign. So there's a scientist who was trying to get admitted to the US that was a Nazi scientist. The US was denying that request. And he wrote in his reference letter for that person, he was writing about the Nazi regime that, quote, "I have no doubt that the Nazi party sincerely wished to benefit the German racial stock, especially by the elimination of manifest defectives, such as those who are deficient mentally, and do not doubt that the scientist gave, as I should have done, his support to such a movement." Could also talk about, we could literally go down the list of people who made these statistics that we use and find similar quotes, but I'll just give one more example, which is Carl Pearson, who we probably all know from Pearson's R, also Pearson's chi-square test, also principal components analysis, lots of things that we use. And so he held the Francis Galton Chair at the University College of London, which is the Francis Galton Chair of Eugenics, that's the full name of that. And that he wrote that we should try to improve ourselves to have, quote, better stocks, which could be achieved chiefly by way of war with inferior races. And Pearson also was anti-Semitic, writing that Jewish immigrants were, quote, inferior physically and mentally and will develop into a parasitic race. So I shared a couple of examples just to really concretize that when we think about statistical analysis, it is not ideologically neutral. It's not sort of apolitical in some way, like the folks making these sort of creating the tests and logics that we use in statistics, created them for really specific purposes, and those purposes were white supremacist, anti-Semitic, and entirely rooted in eugenics. So the result is that we have this whole set of tools that have logics that stem from and perpetuate inequality. True in a lot of areas. It's particularly true in fields like psychology and education, where we've taken up a lot of the social statistics and the intelligence testing whole regime of things that come from that. And so one framework that's emerged over the past several years is QuantQueer, so CRT plus quantitative methods, critical race theory. And so I want to talk just a second about this because in thinking about how queer theory might show up in these spaces, I tried to start from the place that critical race theory enters into quant methods, so as to have a little bit more intersectional perspective that takes up the insights from race scholars as we think about what queer theory might add or change about some of the approaches. So QuantQueer essentially has 5 tenets. The first is the centrality of racism, that racism is a central, organizing, permanent, and endemic feature of Western society. That numbers are not neutral, so it's easy to think about, the numbers don't lie or something like that, right? But they actually do. Numbers aren't neutral, they're ideological constructions. Categories are not natural or given. And here in QuantCrit, people think a lot about racial categories, which are absolutely not biological categories. They're absolutely not natural categories. They're ideological, socio-political categories. And of course, we can see that really clearly play out because the meaning of those categories has shifted dramatically over time. And who belongs in which category and how many categories we have and what we think those categories mean all shifts over time. They're not sort of self-evidently true. That the data cannot speak for themselves, that in order to contextualize and understand data, we would need to have community voice and insight from the people those data came from and the people that the interpretations will affect, and then the necessity of an equity and justice orientation. And so just briefly highlight that set of tenets because there'll be some pretty clear parallels that talk about what I'm thinking about, where we might add some queer perspectives and queer theory ideas into the mix. So in terms of queer perspectives, one of the tensions we have is that quantitative methods proceed from a positivist perspective, the idea that there is some sort of knowable, concrete, and sort of stable truth that we can get to. And of course, queer theory rejects that idea. It involves a continuous deconstruction of the tenets of positivism. And so that makes there a pretty strong tension between queer theoretical perspectives and quantitative methods, just sort of from the start. And queerness is about subversion, and subversion is a thing that Butler writes is the kind of effect that resists calculation. And so because of that, we're talking about the things that we're interested in seeing in queer theory are things that are inherently difficult or impossible to calculate. So how do we quantify those things? So the existing work that's sort of out there, a lot of them have focused on measurement of identity categories, usually sexual identity, but sometimes gender identity as well, looking for better ways to get at measuring identities. And then others have called for like a sort of a deeper engagement with queer perspectives and quant methods, particularly queer theory. So that's what I'm hoping to think about a little bit. So the first thing that I think about is one of the core tenets of QuantCrit and critical race theory is that numbers are not neutral. And so in thinking about that, I think from a queer theoretical perspective, we would say that, yes, numbers are not neutral. Furthermore, numbers aren't real. There's no underlying material reality that the number is just like reflecting. It's not some, there's not a latent construct because queer theory also involves a rejection of the idea of interiority. There's no there. It's only what we construct in discourse. And so in that same frame of thinking, the numbers that we generate are probably better understood as political and cultural symbols versus a reflection of some underlying material reality. Although the numbers aren't neutral or real, that doesn't mean that they can't be useful or generative. They can, right? And numbers can have a certain degree of power to sort of shape realities. But I think that it's important for us to recognize that once we do construct numbers, those numbers then sort of gain a power to create and constrain which realities are knowable, which realities are representable, which realities are possible. And so this idea that quantifying a thing can actually constitute the thing itself, even if that thing only existed at the level of discourse. The second thing I'm thinking about is related to this idea about the non-neutrality of categories from QuantQueer. So in QuantQueer, there's the recognition that categories aren't neutral, that where the lines between categories are drawn and who draws those lines are subjective acts, are arbitrary in some ways. And here, of course, queer theory has a lot to say about categories. Queer theory and queer theorists are really skeptical of categories. The idea being that like creating and reifying categories of difference, it actually creates a range of possible or restricted performativities. So categories aren't things that we choose, but we're forced to negotiate. The existence of the category actually disciplines the subjects of the category is meant to name in ways that creating a category has the power to actually create the conditions the category is initially meant to just describe. So I think we can ask questions like, what's the purpose and use for the categories we're trying to measure? Are there more humanizing ways we can get at those same things? And how can we interpret those results rather than thinking of those as like sort of stable natural realities as social and ideological, and how that might change the way we interpret results. Categories are risky. Categorizing and labeling things is risky. This is one of the core insights of queer theory. There's a deep risk in labeling. That doesn't mean we can never use categories, but rather that we need to be really mindful about how the categories were constructed, what work those categories are doing, and to be aware of the risks that they pose and think about how we might navigate those risks, and also balance those risks versus the potential benefits. Additionally, when we think about data or statistics, there's this tendency that we see in people who are writing about quantitative results to use like the present perfect tense. So it's like, these results show that students are motivated by whatever, right? It makes it sound permanent, right? It makes it sound like this is universal law. We know that this thing is true. And that's all steeped in positivism. And so in queer theory, of course, we're rejecting positivism for the idea of like discursive construction of reality. So we might understand data and statistics rather than them being true as being momentary representations that are sort of filtered through political, ideological, and historical lenses. Because people don't exist as static beings, they are fluid, evolving, changing, always in becoming. Because of that, we should not really be thinking about statistical results or data points as stable. They're momentary, fluid representations. So there's a particular moment in time and place and space where this happened. That doesn't mean it happens everywhere or is in some way stable or generalizable. Even that same person the next day, the same thing may not be true of them anymore. So there is a need to resist the impulse to stabilize and solidify our findings as permanent or generalizable. And I would actually argue that a queer theoretical perspective would wholesale reject the idea of generalizability or reproducibility. The other thing is that the construction of statistics actually structures, constrains, and predetermines what is representable. So in QuantQueer, there's this emphasis on the importance of voice and experience, which comes out of the CRT piece about counter storytelling, counter narratives. And in queer theory, there's an emphasis on subversion, and particularly subversion of cultural norms around what's normal or acceptable. So this idea of like queering as a verb, right? So in quantitative work, we, I think, need to think about what decisions we're making around measurement and sampling, because those decisions predetermine and constrain whose voice can be heard, what thoughts or actions or experiences matter or are important or are worth representing. So we're predetermining the forms of representation that might be possible in our data. So how could quant researchers better capture subversion or counter narratives? And some thoughts I have are around things like participatory methods, community-based methods, But also a thing that quant folks tend not to do is engaging around reflexivity and subjectivities, and not with the goal of eliminating subjectivity or like reducing bias or whatever thing people always say from a positivist perspective about that, right? But instead to sort of embrace the subjectivity as part of the inquiry and thinking seriously about that. Also, a thing that has been really prominent in the work that's been done on and with queer populations, queer and trans populations in quantitative work, is that it has tended to be really individualizing in its focus. So thinking about how does a queer or trans student navigate a college campus? How does a queer or trans student experience the campus climate? How do they experience English literature curriculum? This tends to, and this is true of quant work in general, tends to construct this model where we're locating a lot of the phenomena sort of within the body. We're putting them sort of interior to participants or people. And queer scholarship in general has been critiqued for this focus on the body, specifically on LGBTQ bodies. But we actually don't think queerness is constrained in those ways, that queerness is difficult to define because it's, and this is a quote here, that paradoxically undefined, but emphatically not synonymous with same-sex sexuality. So queer scholars have over the past decade or so written more about the need to theorize beyond the body, to think about systems and discourses in which these bodies exist more robustly. So I think that queer quant work can actually be pretty well positioned to think of beyond the body, looking at systems, ideologies, and discourse that give rise to the kinds of categories of difference and the conditions of marginalization that we observe, because there are some opportunities with quant methods, right, to measure the operation of systems, to measure ideological stakes that are in place in a context, for example. So I think gives some opportunities to think beyond the body, looking at systems and ideologies. And then another piece I think that will be important for people thinking about queer theory and quantitative work, or queerness and quantitative work, is this idea of humility and transience, that like one of the sort of core calls in queer theory is that we have to avoid thinking of these ideas as stable. I mean, for example, Butler is sort of famous for writing that we might eventually no longer use the word queer at all when it ceases to have revolutionary potential. And this idea that we need to be willing to be moved beyond what we think is queer, and to be more tentative, more able to shift, more transient in the way that we think about these things. And so I think, for example, I don't think that there is such a thing as a queer quantitative method. I think that there are ways that we can queer quantitative methods, and that what that will look like will necessarily have to shift and change over time. And I think that we'll have to reject their idea of there being a right way to do it. We could probably find some wrong ways to do it, right, that are like harmful, but I think rejecting the idea of a right or true way to do that, we would expect queerness to proliferate approaches, not to collapse approaches. And so what I hope is that some of the tenets or ideas that I'm presenting are more like provocations or questions, not rules or guidelines, because I think that a queer quantitative methodology has to resist becoming sort of sedimented or stabilized. I do think there's some key questions that we can ask, such as how could quantitative methods better take up fluidity and tentativeness? How could they more fully articulate and engage with the idea that numbers and categories are ideological rather than sort of just reflections of reality? How we could better center voice and experiences, particularly those that subvert dominant hegemonic discourses. How we could better engage with humility and transience with less certainty. And this one I see, like I teach a lot of quant methods courses, and it seems like some students are really drawn to quant methods because like you get the right answer and you can be really sure you got it right. And so then what I think I'm asking is for us to let go of that sense of certainty, which can be really comforting. And how we can better attend to systems, ideologies, and power dynamics while de-emphasizing sort of intrapsychic factors in some ways. I didn't do too bad on time. Okay. What I'm hoping is we can have some discussion about thoughts about queerness and quantitative research or questions, but I'll stop sharing so that it's less weird on the screen.
Thank you, Camden. This was great. I'm trying to like find my little react button, but I will stop the recording now if folks feel comfortable with that. And as folks want to, they can unmute and ask questions. And if it starts to seem like we need to have external moderation, I'm happy to make a queue. But otherwise, I think it's up for grabs.